Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon from wherever time zone you are joining this event. First of all, thanks to Ras for organizing this great event. I hope you have been learning a lot of great things in this event. I just wanted to continue this learning journey by just sharing some of the tips that I've actually experienced while doing a lot of implementation with a lot of customers in the model-driven app, Dynamic 365, and the Microsoft Dataverse. So just wanted to share some of the the fundamental concepts that what sort of best practices and the guidance that you have to follow while designing your Microsoft Dataverse solution. So just begin my session with a quick introduction. My name is Arpish Srivastav. I am a Microsoft MVP Business Application, 2 times awarded. I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer. I'm working as a Power Platform architect in Capgemini, Sweden. I'm also leading the Dynamic 365 India user group, and I'm the ambassador of Power community. Okay, I've done all the certifications of the Power family, PL 100, 200, 600, and MB 600s as well. I've been writing blogs since 2014. So if you just want to check out my, all the interesting stuff that I'm sharing related to the Power Platform Dynamics, you can just go and check it out at arpitpowerguy.com. And there also you get the details about my social media channels as well, like my LinkedIn, Facebook. You can just subscribe to my YouTube channel as well, where I put all the recordings of the sessions and some interesting videos related to the Power Platform. So yeah, this is about me. If I talk about the agenda, because I have a lot to cover, I just try to grab some of the things from my experience. It's not possible to complete all the best practices, all the guidelines in a 1 hour span of time, but I just try to collect all the you know the best practices that I have experienced in my in my projects actually. So this is the agenda, like Microsoft Dataverse design, working with business logics, working with data, working with metadata, API integrations, and obviously if you have any questions, then yeah, you can ask me. So let's quickly begin with the Microsoft Dataverse design. So some of the best practices I just wanted to follow, like, we have a lot of things to do in the Microsoft Dynamics 365 Power Platform and other components. But sometimes, we do a lot of mistakes at the beginning of the project, right? While designing the Dataverse, while choosing the components, while choosing the right component, especially because we have so many things, right now. You have to attend the ignites, you get, you have to keep on updated yourself with the Microsoft releases. A lot of components are being deprecated, a lot of new components are being released, so there are a lot of confusions around, right? So you need to keep in mind certain things while design the solution, so that you not end up messing up your solution, and working on your shit at the later stage rather doing something productive, right? So that is the main objective of this session, just to keep all these things in a mind while starting or working in your project. Okay, so the first thing is that choose the right component. So this is very important things, like, there are a lot of components of the Dynamic 365 Power Platform, but you always uh, in a confusion, like what should sort of components we should use. So choosing the right component is the key. So that is, I actually put it on the first topic, like choose the right component. So choosing the right component is the key before start doing implementation. So whether it's Dynamic 365 or the Power Platform, so you should always choose the right component to develop your requirement. Your approach should be depend on the type of implementation, obviously. So you should first focus on what are the out-of-box features that a particular app or particular components provide. So you first go with the out-of-box solution. If you're working any project, or if you're getting the requirement, if you are dealing with your clients, then first of all you should concentrate on what are the out-of-box feature that Microsoft provides, right? You should not create any custom component or writing code for something that is already available in the market, or that is already is a ready-made components available in the Dynamics, right? So you need to understand, like, first of all, you should focus on the out-of-box features like the dashboards, tables, columns, views, and all. And you should showcase the out-of-box capabilities of your Dataverse or the Dynamics 365. Then you should go with the app sources. So sometimes what happen is, so for example, if you're working for the banking sectors or for the healthcare sectors, right? So sometimes what happen is Microsoft has already given some of the escalators to you. So rather, designing the whole, system from the scratch, you can just go and check it out. What are the available escalators that Microsoft has provided to you? It makes your life easy. You don't need to develop the things from the scratch, but it's totally up to your organization or your customer decision whether you want to adopt these escalators or any app sources. So there are n number of apps or solutions are published by the independent service vendors as well in the app source. So you can just go and check out some of the features. So if I talk about the DocuSign, so DocuSign is a feature where you can go in the app source and can find out to start integrating it with your Dynamic 365, rather doing the same logic or the same concept of the DocuSign by your own, right? So these kind of things you should check out in the app source ISB solution, Microsoft Escalator, that you can just ready-made install it in your Dynamics and can start using it, right? If anything that is not possible using out of box or app source, then you should move it to the no code part. In the no code, we have some of the components that using that you can write your business logic without writing any code. So like you have the business rules, business process flows, workflows, formula columns that is currently in preview, and the Canvas app. So these kind of things you can use it without writing code. Sometimes the no code is also not enough. You have to write some sort of code. Then you can go with the low code approach, right? Right. You can go with the Power Automate where you can write your expression to write your business logics. You can go to the Power FX, right? So I think you should start, writing the Power FX in your model-driven app forms rather than the JavaScript, unless it is really required, or the custom pages, which is which is actually the replacement of the dialogues and many more things. And at last, we can go with the pro code, obviously. Like if any of the things is not fitting your requirement, then definitely Microsoft has given a lot of ways to design your own components. So you can write your pro code. You can design your PCF controls, custom controls, and the web APIs. You can extend you can design your own C# applications, your own window applications, Azure functions, API management services, and plugins, obviously, right? So this should be your think process while start implementing any requirement, that you should first go with the out of box, then app source, then no code, low code, and pro code. But this is not the thumb rule. Everyone has their own way of thinking, but that is how I actually start thinking about any requirement before interacting with any client or dealing with the requirement. Okay. The second is always check the Microsoft release plan. That is very important in my perspective. Like, because you start doing the implementation, which and you are start using the component which is going to be deprecated in the next 6 months or the 1 year, right? So you have to think about that what sort of component you have to choose, because you have to carefully choose the components. Otherwise, what happens, sometimes we start developing our own component which is not there in the Dynamics, but later on after 3 months it's in the release plan of the Microsoft, right? So you should not end up wasting your effort for designing the component which is already going to be available after a few months, right? So always check the Microsoft release plan before start designing your components, because the component that you're designing may deprecate in long run or being replaced with some other components, right? And Microsoft has recently, developed a new portal using Power Apps portal. They have designed this release plan portal, so you can go and check it out, and you can just simply check like what sort of Microsoft planning in next 6 months or 1 year. They are planning the new components. What is planning in next 6 months? What is they are in their the roadmap. So everything you can just check it out. So for example, if you get the requirement like as an administrator, you will be able to restrict unauthorized access to your database API from your IP ranges outside of your configured business ecosystem. So let's say you are dealing with your client and you just get this requirement. So what should your approach? So first of all, you should check the out of box solution of it. If it is not found, then you should not start creating it. First of all, you should check the Microsoft release plan as well, that there is something that Microsoft is already planning to implement in your Dynamics. So then only you should start designing your component, right? So that is a key thing, that you should always keep yourself updated with the Microsoft releases and updates. Start designing your component within the solution. So that is also important thing. Make a practice to start creating your components within the Microsoft Dataverse solution to avoid facing relationship dependency issues later. Why I have kept this? Because I think this is quite common thing for all of us. Like, we have been learning since day one, like, if we want to do any customization in the dynamic, in the Dataverse, we should first start creating the components within the solution, right? But recently I just faced an issue like we have created a components in one solution, and then we realize, okay, this is not the right solution. We have to create the new solution and we have to migrate all the components from one solution to another solution. So we end up facing a lot of relationship issues, lot of dependencies issues. I was also not sure because I have included all the relationship, included all the dependencies in my original solution, but still it was giving a lot of issues. I'm not sure whether it's corrupted anything in the solution file, and I end up, raising Microsoft tickets, and they strictly told me like, when you are creating any components within the solution, just avoid moving it from one, solution to another solution, because sometimes it corrupts the files, the XML files. So I think it's a good idea that you should first start thinking about creating a solution where gonna use all your components, right? Solution can be up to 32 MB in the size. Okay, so make sure your component size not going beyond that limit, otherwise you'll face issue while importing it. Right, so as Raz was mentioning earlier, like how many solution you want to keep it in your organization, single solution, multiple solution, it's totally up to your own decision, right? So there is no thumb rule. Sometimes you have very less components, then it doesn't make sense that you are creating multiple, solutions. But sometimes if your single solution is going beyond the 32 MB size limit, then obviously it will take time, or it may, you can face a lot of issues if the size going beyond the 32 MB size. So you can break your solution into multiple solutions as well. So for example, you can create a different solution for your plugins or workflows related components, your configuration related components. You can keep it in a simple solution. So that could be a way, right? So, but the thing is that you should manage your solution or your components in a better way and start creating it within the solution. Okay. Another thing I just wanted to check, like there are some of the known limitation is also there. So because sometimes when we start doing implementation, Microsoft has already highlighted this in your limitation part or in the known limitation section, but you just start investigating that, like why I'm facing this issue and all. So always check the known limitation of a particular products as well, so that you should not waste your efforts, your time investigating it, or you can just go with some alternative approach to do that, right? So it's a good practice that you should always check the known limitation of any components that Microsoft has already highlighted in their documentations. Modification of the solution file. Sometimes, sometimes we need to modify the customization.xml or solution.xml file, but it is recommended to update the solution file, but only for the limited task. Okay, so you can do it for the ribbon customization, application navigation customization, doing sitemap, form and dashboards, and the saved query customization. Except that for any of the need, if you want to customize or change the solution file, then it is not recommended. Obviously, you can export the manage solution, extract the content of the solution package, edit the customization XML. So this is the way how you used to do the modification in the solution file. But just make sure, like not every time you have to do this approach, right? Otherwise, you end up facing messing up a lot of things in your organization. And sometimes when you making changes in the solution file is unsupported as well, that may not relevant in the upcoming releases as well, right? So just make sure like whatever changes you are doing, the solution file should is supported as per the Microsoft. Use only database web services. Okay, so you should always use the Dataverse web services. So we have the two services, three types of services that we have: the web API, organization services, and the discovery services. Web API and organization service are all the same, that basically used to interact with the data, and discovery service is basically used to find the the organization in your tenant, right? But it is always recommended, like we should always avoid using creating, application programming interface other than the documented API. We should always, so whether we are creating our own component, your own application, we just need to stick with the Dataverse web services. Okay, so we have to either use the web API or the organization services if you are interacting with the Dataverse data. Okay, because Microsoft strive to keep the the API backward compatibility, right? But reserve the rights to change the API or additional features. So maybe in the future release, if you find like there is some new enhancements, some new changes in the API, so you just need to keep rely on the web API, organization service, and the discovery service that Microsoft provide, rather creating your own application programming interfaces. Okay. Environment variables is very important things. I know like some of you have been already using the environment variables, but as I told you, like there are some of the limitations are also there that Microsoft has highlighted. So you need to just keep in a mind like these are the limitation, because recently I was doing some of the some DevOps automations, some custom connector deployment, and I had some of the environment variables. So I end up wasting around 2 days of my time because I didn't check the limitations that Microsoft has put it on their MS Docs, right? So I don't want you to face the similar situation. So always check the limitations that Microsoft has given related to a particular component. So environment variable, as you already know, that it is basically used to store the configuration related settings or API related details. Sometimes you can store the SharePoint URL as well. So for example, if you have some sort of logic that uploads the documents on the SharePoint, so you probably have the different sites on the test environment, production, or the UAT, right? So you don't want to hard code the URL. Some similar like the APIs. When you are calling the APIs, you always have the different URLs and the configuration across the environment. So you should always use the configuration settings or the input parameter, the environment variable, and you can store there. SharePoint URL, you can also do it. Duration and time, or sometimes you get the requirement from the client that you have to send the reminder email after 15 days, something like that. So you can just put that 15 days or the 15 value in the configuration settings, rather hard coding it in the Power Automate or any of the business logic, because later your client can say to 30 days or can 45 days. So you don't need to go to the code and all, right? You can just directly do it in the configuration settings or in the environment variables, and the code will, or the your component will be intacted, right? So this is the things like environment variables. You should always use it to store all sort of configuration settings. Okay, and obviously you should keep all the limitation as well in the mind. Like if you are making any changes in the environment variable, then you have to go and manually update the custom connector. So because environment variables are not now supported in the custom connectors as well. So if your custom connector are using any sort of API configurations like client IDs, client secrets and all, so you can just keep it in the environment variable, rather hard coding it directly in your custom connector. But sometimes what happen is if you are deploying it using Azure DevOps or CI/CD pipeline, then your environment variables doesn't reflect it in your target instance. So you have to go to that custom connector and that manually hit the update command. So there are some of the limitation that is not the long run limitation. Obviously, Microsoft has their in their mind, so probably they're going to fix it in the next release it. But yeah, but when you are designing now, then you have to keep these things in mind. Don't hard code the string of messages in the code, right? So so for example, if you're working for a client that initially support the English language, so you just design your plugin code and JavaScript code, and you put a lot of hard coded strings, messages, and error messages in the English languages. Later you get to know like the client start supports the other languages as well. So in that case, it will be too much effort for you to change the code or change the string messages wherever you have hard coded it in your business logic, right? So always use the regex web resource. So we have a new type of web resource available in the Dataverse, that is regex, that is stand for resource file. So you can just simply go in the Visual Studio like I have demonstrated in the in the picture. Like you can just go to the Visual Studio, you can create a resource file, and you can just simply define your message like that. So I have just defined some of the English messages. Similar like that, you can create your own XML and define the messages for the other languages as well, for Chinese, Japanese, Swedish, Dutch, something like that. And in your JavaScript code, you can simply use this syntax xrm.utility to get resource string. So like you can see here, if I have to throw the duplicate error message, I'm just passing the key duplicate error message. So whatever duplicate error message value is there, like duplicate record found, it will be thrown out, right? So rather than I'm hard coding the string, I'm just referring it from the JSX web resource. So for each language, you have to create the own web resource. So for example, if you are configuring 5 languages in your environment, then you have to create the 5 web resources. OK, so each language has their own web resource, and you have to design and you have to configure the string messages there. So it's not only about the JavaScript. If you're writing plugin, custom workflow, or any sort of custom C# code, right? You can simply do that. Or this web resource is also supported now in the custom pages as well. So if you are designing your custom pages, and you can simply import that web resource in your custom pages, and you can simply provide the key to get the value of that web resource, right? So you don't need to hard code in the custom pages as well. Moving on to the next part, the manage Dataverse storage. Okay, so this is also very important thing. You have to manage your database storage, because sometimes when we start doing the project or implementation, we just start storing each and everything in the Dataverse, right? But in the beginning of the project, you have to just make sure, like, don't store the large files, attachments, or document in the Dataverse, because it will be too costly for you to store these files. Instead, you use the SharePoint, because it's out of integration available. So you can just store the files directly in the SharePoint. Data which is not being used frequently in the CRM. This is also very important thing, because sometimes what happen is we store all sort of data in the Dataverse only, right? So, but we have to plan it very carefully. The data which is not being used frequently in your CRM, you just wanted to use that data for the logging purpose, or monitoring, reporting, or just for the analyzing purpose, or you want to do some sort of artificial intelligence on top of that data, or you want to do some auditing kind of stuff, then you can keep the data outside the Dataverse, like in the Azure SQL Server or Azure Data Lake, right? You don't need to keep it in the CRM. So that is the part of the planning that you can just do it. Like unless it is really required, then you can keep it in the Dataverse. Otherwise, you can just keep your data outside, right? It doesn't make sense, because you have to keep on archiving the data as if it is possible. Delete the system jobs with the status successful. So yeah, this is also important. Like there could be a multiple system jobs in your Dataverse, so that can increase the Dataverse size. And you can just plan to store the email attachments and other files in SharePoint, and point it to Dataverse data as well. And delete auditing logs, because recently I face the similar situation. Like we have a lot of attachments in the notes, and then later we got to know, like, this Microsoft Dataverse size is increasing, so we have to migrate all the Dataverse nodes to the SharePoint. Then it's quite difficult, because sometimes when you have to migrate the heavy attachments from Microsoft Dataverse to the SharePoint, the Power Automate is not the best fit for it, because there is a limitation, like you cannot send the data more than 100 MB, right? So these kind of limitation you faces when you migrate the document in the later phase from the Dataverse to the SharePoint. So it's very good practice that you need to keep these things in a mind at the initial level of the project. Okay. Now, so these are about some of the basic things about the design. Now, if I talk about the business logic, so the business logic, there could be multiple business logic you can write, but I have taken some of the best practices from the plugins, workflows, and the client side scriptings. Okay, so we have been writing a lot of scripts and the plugins and C# code, but there are a couple of things that you should keep in mind while writing the code or business logic in Dataverse. Don't use execute multiple request or execute transaction request, because These two messages are specifically provided by Microsoft to perform the long operations, right? And plugin is not the component that should be perform the logic, the long run processes, right? That's taking long time. So don't use the execute multiple request and execute transaction request message within the context of plugins or the workflow activities, because these messages basically provide the batch messages where code is being executed outside your platform execution pipeline. So we usually use these messages in case of bulk operation or the bulk update or creation of bulk transaction basically. So if you have a need like you have to perform some sort of the bulk operation in the plugin, I don't recommend to use the plugin. If you have anything that where you have to write the logic or you have to perform the logic on the bulk records, I would recommend to keep that logic outside the Dataverse rather in the Dataverse itself, right? Because plugin has the limit of 2 minutes, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. So that could hamper your Dataverse performance or your client application. So it's better that such kind of bulk operation you can keep it outside the Dataverse, maybe in the Azure, right? Yeah, so this is just an example, like this is the plugin code where what I'm doing is I'm just retrieving the account from the context and just looping through all the accounts available in my Dataverse and appending the updated word at the end, right? So it's not recommended that you use the execute multiple batch operation because you are not sure like how long it's gonna take, right? And plugin has a limit of 2 minutes. So this pattern must be avoided. Do not duplicate plugin step registration, okay? Because sometimes what happen is we create the duplicate plugins and just forget to disable those plugins. So duplicate plugin step registration will cause the plugin file multiple times. Obviously, you end up facing multiple transaction in the database on the same message. This could lead to the delayed the process of a synchronous job, unresponsive model driven app, so client interaction in your browser also stops responding. Okay, so if I talk about this, so this kind of things you need to avoid, like sometimes you accidentally create multiple steps of the same message. So you don't need to do that. So if you already did that, then disable it or deactivate that, or rather remove it. Do not use parallel execution within plugin and workflow activities. That is also a very important thing, that multi-threading or some parallel kind of calls within the plugins or your custom workflow activities can basically corrupt your the connection with the Dataverse, right? So sometimes you face issues like general SQL error. Okay, the transaction active in this session has been committed or aborted by another session. So this is due to the parallel execution being done. So sometimes when the multiple developers are working on the same project, so you need to have the proper communication when you are writing any sort of business logic, so that you should not create any sort of plugins or the workflow activities that is being executed in the parallel form. Okay, because at the Microsoft side, they have actually the sandbox services, and it is basically designed to execute calls in a specific order. And if they find that the multiple transaction is being done at the same time, then definitely it will abort the operation. Okay, limit the registration of the plugins for retrieve and retrieve multiple. So that is very important things. So retrieve and retrieve multiple plugins, you should avoid it. Microsoft has given you the two different messages, retrieve and retrieve multiple, but it is not supposed to be used very frequently. Okay, because it may impact your application performance as well. Okay, so you should avoid using or registering message on the retrieve and retrieve multiple unless it is really required. Okay. Next part is include filtering attributes with the plugin registration. I think this is quite basic. Like now when you are registering your plugin, you should use the filtering attribute. The objective of using filtering attribute is basically that you should triggering your plugin on update on a specific attribute change, right? So filtering attributes basically come into the picture when you are registering your plugin on the update message. So that basically you say to the Dataverse like I want to trigger my plugin when these attributes have been changed in the Dataverse, right? So if you're not, considering this filter attribute, so let's say I'm not selecting any filtering attribute, that means anything or any changes made on the account entity will trigger this plugin, right? and this may impact your performance as well, and it may trigger some additional business logic as well. Okay, so for example, like there is another plugin or another workflow or Power Automate or maybe any other components which is written on the account number field update, right? That you don't want to trigger it. But when you don't use the filtering attributes here, so that will trigger the other business logic or the events which is registered on the same tables. So you should always use the filtering attributes, and not only in the filtering attributes, but when you are performing service.update within your code, whether your C sharp, whether it's your custom workflow or your plugin, when you update, when you're writing this code like service.update, then you have to make sure like the object that you are passing, the entity object that you are passing must have only those attributes that you are actually trying to update in the Dataverse. Because sometimes when you put the service.update in your code and you have not specified the specific attribute, it does the same. It actually update the whole table data in the database, and it actually unintentionally trigger the other events as well. Okay, so this is very important things from the development perspective, that you have to specify the attribute that you're going to use, whether it's a plugin registration tool or whether it's your plugin code. Okay. Manage plugins in a single solution. So that is very important thing. Like sometimes what happen is, we use multiple solution to store the plugins, right? So for example, like the plugin basically made up of two things. You already know it. The first is plugin assembly and the second is the plugin type. So plugin is basically two type, basically has two part, plugin assembly and the plugin type. Okay. Plugin assembly basically has the binary content of the assembly. Okay. The code that you are writing. Plugin type is basically the step that you are registering, like for update lead, create lead, update account or create account. So these kind of things goes into the plugin type. Okay. And the plugin type and the plugin assembly both are stick to each other. So if you try to separate the plugin assembly and plugin type in a different solution, you end up facing a lot of solution errors. Okay. So it's a good practice that you have to keep your plugins in a single solution. Don't distribute them in a multiple solution. Let me give you an example. The example number one is the upgrade an existing solution. So let's say you already have the solution in your target environment. There you have two solutions, another solution and the plugin solution. In the another solution, you have the plugin with the plugin type update lead, and the plugin solution also have the update lead. So that means you have the plugin in the two different solution in your target instance, another solution and the plugin solution. Okay. Now, when you try to update the plugin solution by changing the version of it to 2.000 and include a new plugin type called create account. Okay, so this will fail because the top layer solution component one, another solution doesn't have that particular plugin type, right? So that is the one thing that you always have to keep remember, that your plugin should be in all the solutions in the single solution. Now, this is also a case in target environment. The basic assembly has the following solution link. So let's say in the target, I have this plugin solution, which has two plugin types, update and the create account. Now you try to install a new solution, which again has the same plugin. Okay. Again, you get the same error because you have not included the update lead plugin type in that. Okay. So the main objective is that, whether you have the multiple plugin solution, but just always try whatever plugin types and plugins assemblies is there, you include everything in that particular solution to avoid this kind of situation. Tracing service, I think I don't need to put more effort in that, because tracing service is basically you should use it in the workflow activities, custom workflow activities, and in your plugin, just to trace it, because it's very sometimes it's very difficult to debug or troubleshoot the plugins when you have the long the large amount of code in it, right? So you should always use the tracing service in your plugin just for the logging and the tracing purpose. So this is a good best practices actually. Use invalid plugin execution in your plugin and workflow activities. So the only thing is that I think you already know, like invalid plugin execution is used to throw the error message, but sometimes you want to create to show some kind of HTML content in that. So don't use it. because invalid plugin execution doesn't show any sort of HTML languages. So if you try to do that, it will show the rich text like this. Like for example, if I try to bold my duplicate error text character, then it will not showcase like that. And another thing is that you should always use the resx web resource to to use your error messages that I've already highlighted in my earlier slide. Timeout making external calls in a plugin, that is also very important thing. Like if you are writing a plugin call where you're calling any external web APIs or the services that may take long time, so you should always because plugin doesn't know like how long it's gonna take, but it will wait for 2 minutes because it is the threshold time. So it will wait for 2 minutes for the default timeout period. So rather doing that, you should always keep some sort of timeout to check. Otherwise, it will hamper your your app performance as well. Optimizing assembly development. This is also very important thing. So while you are doing development, you are writing your plugin code or the custom assemblies, it is very important that your assembly size is not going beyond the 16 MB size, because sometimes what happen is we manage a single project to have all the the custom code like the custom workflows and the plugins. So you can do it, and it's a best practices to do that also. But sometimes when the size is going beyond the 16 MB, then it's not a good idea. So it's better you can just segregate your solution. But it's always recommended that your custom workflow activity should not be more than 50 activities in a single assembly. Okay, so this is also very important thing. You should not use the custom workflow activities more than 50. If you try to do that, has an assembly size constant of 16 MB. So because that is the maximum size of it, and the plugins and the workflow activities developed with a Dataverse solution should exist with the other in a single Visual Studio project. I think that is a good idea. But in case sometimes what happens is you have to selectively deploy some of the plugins, not the custom workflow to the target organization. So in that case, you can keep that project different. And the another thing is the physical assembly size is more than the 16 MB, then definitely you can not use the single project. You have to split that project into the multiple projects. Okay. All right, now if I talk about the client side scripting, there are two main things. You should not use the window.top and writing the DOM-based script in your code. Okay, so window.top is not recommended, especially for the Dynamics 365 app for Outlook, Dynamics 365 phones and tablets. Okay, any external application that hosts the Dataverse within the iframe, so just not recommended. But in any ways, if you don't have any option or you have to use it window.top, then first of all you need to check whether you can access that window.top or not, instead of directly accessing it. Okay, so you can write this the code that I have depicted in the right picture. Like if you want to it's not recommended, but if you want to use it because you don't have any other option, then you first need to check whether the top location is available for you. If yes, then you can write your business logic. If not, then you cannot use it. So you should avoid writing such kind of code in your script. Okay, window.top. Considering disabling navbar when programmatically opening forms or the views. Okay, sometimes when you have to open a particular page, using the ASPX, right? So just make sure like you are, just be very sure whether you want to show the navigation bar as well, because navigation bar comes up with a lot of, the ribbon toolbar that you may not want to, every time you may not need that toolbars buttons, right? So it may create the performance issues when you are loading the navigation bar. So you can just check whether you want to include the navigation bar as well while opening a particular page programmatically. Do not use the OData endpoint. So obviously there is no immediate symptoms, but yeah, code using endpoint will stop working. So Microsoft has extended the release date, the deprecated date of the OData v2.0 endpoint. Earlier it was November 2022. Now they have extended to April 2023. So if you are still using the OData v2.0, then stop using that and start using the web API. Dynamics 365 Web API that support the 4.0 version. And obviously in the model-driven app, you have to start using the XRM Web API, which provide access to the Dataverse Web APIs. Okay, so if you are still using OData v2.0, stop using it and just start using the Web API. Remove the deactivated or the disabled customization. Sometimes, in our solution, if any components we are not using it, we just deactivate that or just put it in the draft mode. So just make sure like if that particular component is no longer required in the solution, just remove it. Okay, so that is also a good practice to keep your solution healthy and clean. Interact with the HTTP and the HTTPS resources. Sometimes in your JavaScript code, you need to call any external APIs, especially the HTTP or HTTPF resources. So it's always a good practice that you call that APIs in the asynchronous mode, same like the plugins, right? So you should avoid writing the synchronous logic as much as possible, just to make your system performance better. So just to avoid the unresponsive model-driven app, Canvas app, and slow client interaction, you just use the, this synchronous calling of the HTTP request. Okay, so this is the way you should avoid. You should not write this kind of script. If you are calling any APIs, you should not call it as a synchronous API because it can impact your system performance. Use namespaces in the JavaScript. So there are a couple of ways to write a better JavaScript code. So I'm not going to comment on that. There are different ways. You can just have a look at it. But I think namespace is a better way to organize your code in your Dynamics 365. Namespaces are basically used to help organizing your code in the logical groups. Sometimes your code, the single model-driven app can be used for the multiple business units, right? So you can have the same common code available. So for example, like you have the same functions that you want to use for the US client and for the UK client. But if you want to specifically call that particular function, then but so that you can use the namespaces. Okay, so when writing an app, yeah, I can simply reference each piece of code using this fully qualified. So you can check here. I have the same function format mobile number, but when I'm calling it using namespaces, it will individually call that mobile number using that namespace, right? So if you can see it, d365.us, the format number is a different function, and the d365.uk is a different function, right? So you can have the same function name, but if you are not using the namespace, it will considered as a global function. But if you are using the namespace, it will look like this, like I have demonstrated in the right picture. Another thing is that use less code on the form load. I think this is also very important thing. Don't write too much business logic on your long running business logic on your form load. Remove the unwanted line of code and libraries. Writing reusable code as much as possible to avoid rewriting same business logic. Remove deactivated business logics. Business rules, because anyways, if it is deactivated but it's loading in the background, keep the command bar as as light as possible. So if it is if particular button is no longer is required, if you're not using it, then just remove it from the command bar. Write the logic in the PowerFX instead JavaScript unless it is really required. Okay, so these kind of things you can consider while writing the client-side scripting. Working with data. Okay, so we know like Microsoft Dataverse has a lot of data. So how you can deal with the data? So use web services to work with the data. So basically how you can decide like you have to interact with the Microsoft Dataverse data. So because this is quite common requirement, because within the Dynamics 365 or Dataverse, you can do it without performing any sort of business logic. But if you are dealing with your Microsoft Dataverse outside, for example, plugin, custom workflow, or any external client applications, right? So in that case, how you can interact with your Dataverse data? So there are basically two ways. You can either use data service or the organization service. How you can decide that? Basically, it depends on if you can check the flow chart in the right side. If the code you want to return in the .NET framework, then definitely you will first check the plugins or the custom workflow project, and you can use the SDK assembly. So SDK assembly is nothing but the organization service. You actually use the organization service using SDK assemblies with the .sbc extension. But if If you want to write your window client application, then or definitely you can use the XRM tooling assemblies. Okay, you can get it from the Nugget package. And if you want to write the code in the HTTP format, so for example, like this, use web service web API when you have to use. The web API is basically the OData RESTful endpoint. Okay, so use this for any programming language that supports the HTTP request and authentication use, right? So organization service, basically you can use it for the .NET framework. But other than that, if you have to interact with the Dynamics 365 data, regardless of any platform or any languages, then you should always go with the web API. Okay, so this is the way you have to decide, like which way you have to go. Either you have to use this web API or the organization service. Limit the data retrieved from the API. Okay, so whenever you are retrieving the data, whether it's a JavaScript, your Power Automate, your your plugins or custom workflow activities, you need to make sure like how many attributes or what data you are retrieving. So in the left panel, if you can see, I'm just retrieving the name and the address dot city, right? So because I just want to perform the operation on that particular column, so I'm just retrieving only two columns, right? But the right pattern is wrong. I should not use the column set true. Column set true is basically the select star in the SQL query. Because what happened is here I'm only retrieving it. But if I have to perform the service.update that I was mentioning earlier, if I have to perform the service.update in the left code, it will only update the name and address.city. But if I perform the service.update in the right side of code, it will update on the complete table. That may trigger some other business logics as well. So you need to make sure like you are retrieving only specific columns that you are. So it's not only applicable for the plugin. In the Power Automate also you have that option. You can provide the filtering attributes. You can provide your attribute list as well. Working with metadata, choose the right column type. That is very, very important. Like if you are designing your Dynamics 365 Dataverse or solution, you cannot roll back your data type. Once you select the data type, you cannot change it. So for example, I'm just taking a very simple example that I recently faced it. Create field that should allow user to enter 4-digit number 2000. Example. Okay, so I want to create a field. I got the requirement from the client that you have to create a field that should allow user to enter the 4-digit numbers. Now what I will do is I will simply go to the tables and will start creating a new column. And obviously, it actually support the digit number. So what I will do is I will start creating the whole number type field, right? So I will create a whole number type of field and will simply set this as a whole number. Then what happen is if the number format set in my organization is like 1 comma 2 3 4, because in every organization you have the number format settings, right? So when you go to the system settings in the Dynamics 365 in the model driven app, you have the specific formatting of a particular digits, right? So for example, if the formatting is set to 1 comma 2 3 4, then when the user put the 2000 in the whole number field, it will look like this 2 comma and then 30, right? So which may not the intended format to show. So now your client will say like, I don't want to show the comma here. Now what you will do is you will go to the number format settings and will remove that comma from the format. Now you cannot do that because it will impact all the whole number fields in your organization or Microsoft Dataverse, right? Then what you will do is then you have to simply delete that field and you have to create the text type of fields. So this is the way this can be done in the initial phase of the project, but if the later on you get this kind of requirement, then it will be very difficult to roll that back, right? Because whole number field has a specific format, but if you don't want to put some sort of format in a particular field, then you cannot choose the whole number type of field. Okay, so this is the one scenario that you have to choose the correct column type. Choose the lookup data type over choice if options can potentially be changed in the future, right? Sometimes what happen is we see like client has given some of the data model, and we see like we have to create a field which has 3 to 4 option. So we just end up creating simply choice field, right? But what happen is in the later phase of the project, you get to know like some of the values have been increasing, right? So you need to be make sure like if the data or the values of a particular field can potentially be changed, then you should not use the choice. Otherwise, you cannot roll it back to lookup later on, right? So always make sure like always use the lookup if you want to keep that options value configurable without changing the code. So just choose the lookup data type over choices if options can potentially be changed. Another thing, choose the alternative key carefully because field level security cannot be applied on the alternative keys. So that is very important thing because sometimes what happen is we simply apply the alternative. We just randomly go and create the alternative keys just to avoid the duplicate issues and for the update purpose, for the absurd purpose in case of integration. But we have to make sure like if you have created mark a particular field as alternate key, you cannot apply the field level security in the future. Okay, so you need to make sure that in future if you want to mask that particular field, or if you want to apply the security on a particular field, then don't mark it as alternative key. Otherwise you have to remove the alternative key in order to apply the field level security. Working with integration, this is the last thing I want to show you. I still have 7 minutes. So working with integrations. So I know like sometimes we get the requirement to expose our Dynamic 365 or the Microsoft Dataverse data outside the Dataverse, right? You interact with any external applications. So how you can expose your data, how you can consume your external data in the Microsoft Dataverse. So there are a couple of things you need to keep in mind based on my personal experiences. So basically you have two ways, web APIs and the Azure API management, right? Because web API also perform all sort of transactions, right? Because it's basically the RESTful services. So it's a core supported regardless of any platform or regardless of any coding languages, you can use the web APIs, right? But how should I decide, like, whether I can directly give my Dynamics 365 web API to the client? Okay, like this is the URL of my Dynamics 365 API, and you can start interacting with the Dataverse, right? This is not the right approach, but obviously you can create some of the Postman. Sometimes what happen is you can create the Postman collection and share it with your client with the specific Dynamics 365 API, and they can simply perform the operation in your code in your Dataverse, right? But you often in a dilemma like what to choose between the Dynamics Web API and when should I use the APIM? Okay, APIM is nothing but the Azure API management. You can then explore it more, just to know the advantage of it. But Azure API management is basically the Azure component that is basically provide the additional layer on top of the API, and you can provide some additional business logic on top of it. Okay, so if you have some sort of security restriction, if you want to do the better monitoring, if you want to do the better failure management, so some sort of things you can do it with the Azure API management that is not possible with the web API. Okay, so this is just a comparison based on my personal experience. I have actually put it down here. Based on that, you can decide whether you can expose the Dynamics 365 web API to your client, or you need to create the API management tape, right? So if there is no unification is required, then you can go with the Dynamics API. What is the meaning of unification? Sometimes what happen is your client has a specific need, like the URL should be like this, because in our organization we have other integrations, and the format of the URL or the naming convention of the URL should be like this. This cannot be possible in the Dynamics API. You have to share the complete endpoint with the client, that is not updatable, right? But if you have to make the changes in the API naming convention, the name of it, then if you need some sort of unification, then definitely you go with the APIM. Unification is not only in terms of the naming convention, it is also in terms of the architecture. It is also in terms of the request and response, because sometimes your client expect the API integration in the form of JSON, then you can go with the Dynamics API. But if the client API doesn't support the JSON format, they're expecting some other formats like XML, then it is not possible using Dynamics API. You can go with the APIM because it's not only support the JSON and XML, it supports the other formats as well. Okay, APIM is also very useful for the API analytics failure management, and application insights capabilities because it's a Azure component, but these capabilities are not there in the Dynamics API. Another thing that I personally observe is like some of the times because if you have to call the Dynamics API, you first need to get the token. Then you have to pass that token to the Dynamics API in order to perform the transaction, right? Because it's a OAuth based authentication. But that thing you sometimes that client doesn't like it because they need to do the two calls in order to interact with the Dataverse. So that part you can handle it in the API management. So the token generation part, you can do it at your end and then perform the logic. So client only needs to call the API. You will get the token internally and then perform the transaction in the Dataverse, right? So this kind of things you can do it in the API, but cannot do in the Dynamic 365 API. Okay. So this is the way, and in the API, basically, it is basically provide the additional layer of security as well. So if you have such kind of requirement, like you have to do some sort of IP whitelisting, or sometimes you have to do some sort of heavy transformation or some complex business logics as well, right? So you can associate your Azure API management with the Azure functions as well, and some Power Automate as well. Okay, so you can do the transformation as well. So this is basic the difference between Web API and the API. Use application user with limited access for integration. So there are a couple of requirements where you can use the application user to run your Power Automate. So it's always a good practice. So whenever you are creating a Power Automate, don't create it with the licensed user, okay? Because that may impact the license cost, and because that user is not going to use the Dynamics application. So always use the application user or service principal to run your Power Automate. Otherwise, if the user left the organization or if your user is disabled, your all Power Automate will also be in the disabled mode. Okay, so run Power Automate if you want to create any server to server authentication, if you have to interact with the Microsoft Dataverse data externally using any sort of application where there is no need to log into the application. To build the third-party application, to DevOps pipeline connections or multi-factor authentication, these kind of requirements you can go with the application user. But just make sure like sometimes what happen is when we create the application user, we just give them the administrator access in the Dataverse so that without having the license in the Dataverse, they can access anything. So just make sure like just provided them the limited access. So for example, if the user wants to create the lead or retrieve the lead, then only provide the access to the lead table, not access to the complete the data model that we have in the Dataverse, right? So it's always a good practice if you have to make the integration, always use the application user because it's a non-licensed user, and yeah, you can achieve it. These are the requirements using that. Custom pages, Canvas app to display the external data. Sometimes you have to showcase the external data in your database in your Dataverse, right? So sometimes there is a requirement to display the external system data in your model driven app. For example, show the data hierarchy based on the data received from the external app. So if you have to store the data in the Dataverse, then that is fine. You have to anyways store it. But sometimes what happen, you have to just on the fly retrieve the data and display it to the client. Okay, so for example, like I want to show the data hierarchy. I just want to pull the data from any external application and just want to show the relationship of the data to the client. I don't want to store it in the Dataverse. So I think the custom pages and Canvas app is the best way to do that. Okay, you can create a custom page. You can on the fly call that API using connectors or the Power Automate, retrieve the data, design the data as per the client needs using a lot of UI controls, and can just show it to the users, right? You don't need to store it in the Dataverse, that data. Same goes with the Canvas app. Virtual table can also be used to display the external data. What you know if you have to design the data in a particular format on the UI controls, you have to use it. Then virtual table is not the way because virtual table will simply display the data. You cannot change the UI of it. But that custom page and Canvas app can do it. So these are all the things that I have shared based on my project experiences. I know there are a lot of other things left out as well, but definitely I'm going to include that. I am going to put that in my one articles where I will jot down all these best practices that I'm sharing it today, and will put down all other best practices that I was not able to include in this 1 hour session. So definitely I'll put that article and share with you. So thank you so much for bear with me and listening all these things. So you can just follow me. You can just check out my website, or you can just subscribe to my YouTube channel, or maybe you can social media. You can just follow me so that I can share some more interesting ideas about that. Okay. Thank you so much. Over to you, Raz.
Thank you so much, Arpit. Round of applause for Arpit, guys. That was outstanding. You covered quite a lot of important best practices there. I think everyone is very, very happy. So thank you so much, Arpit. And we've kind of gone slightly over, but that's fine.